So first of all, now that we have the full text of this law from Beijing, what's your reaction?
My reaction is this is very, very disturbing. I think this statute by design is intended to pave the way for Beijing to continue to undermine and maybe really trample the freedoms that the people of Hong Kong have enjoyed for so many years, and that the Chinese Communist Party had promised to continue in the basic law. So it's a very disturbing development.
Senator, the U.S. Commerce Department is starting to revoke the special trading status for Hong Kong. How far will the U.S. response go?
Well, it's hard to say. In part, it'll depend on how China responds to this. But there is broad bipartisan concern about the behavior of the government in Beijing. And so we're seeing that manifested in a variety of pieces of legislation in reaction from the administration. So it's a very serious matter.
Senator, there's been some criticism or some analysis that the moves that were announced by Wilbur Ross yesterday was really more symbolic, and that if you really wanted an impactful, I guess, set of sanctions, if you will, you would have to be targeting exports to China, not just Hong Kong, and affecting the export status there as well, right? So in terms of how far it could go, could there be further and, I guess, more significant moves?
Well, yeah, and look, one of the challenges in dealing with this whole situation is that I would certainly prefer that any measures we take in the United States in response to mainland China's crackdown on freedom in Hong Kong, that our response not make life worse for Hong Kongers, right? That would not be the objective. And so that's why my legislation that I introduced with Chris Van Hollen, the Democrat senator from Maryland, what our legislation does is it would impose sanctions on the bad actors in Beijing rather than impose a burden on the people of Hong Kong. I think that's the better approach. To some degree, it's inevitable that we're going to have to reorient our trade with Hong Kong to the extent that Hong Kong really no longer enjoys the autonomy that justified that special treatment in the first place. But this is all part of why I thought it was necessary to focus specific sanctions on the specific bad actors.
We're also hearing there's now a bipartisan bill that's being launched by Congress that addresses potentially providing refugee status for individuals that are at risk of persecution under this new national security law in Hong Kong. Is that something that you're supportive of? Would you potentially look to extend refugee status and welcome, for example, pro-democracy protesters that are now potentially targeted under this bill?
I would support moving in that direction. I think there's a variety of ways we could do it. We could do it by granting a broader classification for refugee status so that the people of Hong Kong would more easily qualify. I'd be open to considering a separate visa track altogether. For starters, I think the United States would benefit enormously from an influx of Hong Kong residents. I lived in Hong Kong for a year. I have a tremendous affection and respect for the people of Hong Kong. But I also see it as a very, very important safety valve, a release valve for the people of Hong Kong if the persecution gets so bad. Obviously, people of Hong Kong would like to stay in their home, but if it becomes so inhospitable, then certainly the United States should be welcome shores.
What are the chances that the president will agree to that and sign that into law, given that we are actually seeing more visa restrictions and so forth for foreigners here in the U.S.?
You're right. We have seen a movement in the other direction as a very general matter. But when these policies pertain specifically to China, then it's a different set of circumstances. So I'm not sure what the president thinks about this, but I would not be surprised to find broad bipartisan interest in doing something to provide this safe haven for the people of Hong Kong.
Something that we have seen for the Hong Kong Autonomy Act, your legislation that's passed the Senate, it will penalize banks doing business with officials that are involved with that security law. The best chance for passage, it seems to be in the House, and then getting to President Trump's desk would be to put in the defense bill. How confident are you that you'll be able to do that? And are you expecting any pushback from the administration?
Well, there are two tracks that we can pursue to get this legislation actually signed into law. As you may have noted, we've already passed this in the Senate, and there is a companion piece of legislation in the House. So it's not far-fetched to see the House pass this legislation and send it separately to the president. But as you point out, there's a parallel track that we're pursuing, which is to get it in the National Defense Authorization Bill, which is on the Senate floor right now, probably gets wrapped up certainly in July. I'm cautiously optimistic, actually, that our legislation, the Hong Kong Autonomy Act, will be included in the National Defense Authorization Bill. We've had extensive conversations. We've worked with the administration, especially the folks in the Treasury Department. So I'm cautiously optimistic. I think we're going to get this done one way or the other.
The administration requested some changes to the bill. Does that make the stance against China a little bit weaker? How does it impact the final outcome of the legislation?
No, the administration mostly was requesting technical changes to just ensure that implementation could proceed smoothly. It was not an effort to water down the legislation, that I can assure you.
Senator, we also had the FCC today officially designating the likes of Huawei and ZTE as national security threats. How significant is this move? And what further moves could we potentially see in the tech space as we continue to, of course, see these tensions between China and the US, China and other developed nations in the tech universe?
Well, you know, the technical industry space is not my area of expertise, so you can imagine probably better than I can the knock-on effect of this. But what I can tell you is it is a reflection of very, very serious concerns that China is increasingly seen as an adversary, not even just a competitor, but an adversary, and one against whom we have to take precautions. We have to protect our own security. And so this is a fairly dramatic step, and it's a powerful symbolic step as well. And I think it speaks to this growing distrust for the regime in Beijing.
There's no doubt this is sort of the great strategic battle of our time, right? So how does that then play into November, and what prospects there is for the Phase 1 trade deal? Because the president really has to strike a fine balance here, right, in terms of his playbook of going tough on China, but also maintaining a relationship that allows the trade aspect to go ahead.
Yeah, so it's, as you point out, this is a very, very complex and very, very important relationship that we're trying to manage. There's no real precedent for having the rise of a new great power that is adversarial in important ways and with whom our economy is so closely linked, so intertwined. So it is a challenge. My preference would be that there would be a sufficient change in behavior on the part of the Chinese government that we could continue very extensive economic interactions, because I think that benefits the people of both countries. And not everybody on our side agrees with that view, but that is my view. My view is that the Chinese government, however, has to really mend some of its ways. We have to see an end to the threat of the intellectual property that we own, coercive technology transfer, even some of the attempts to project power in the Western Pacific that are very disturbing in what their implications are. So it is very complex. I hope that trade arrangements between our countries can continue, but in the context of addressing some of these really problematic challenges.
Senator, just finally, of course, all of these geopolitical tensions coming at a time when the world is really suffering and dealing with this ongoing pandemic. You've been very vocal on wanting to get on with the reopening of the economy. How do you feel now that we're seeing this resurgence of virus cases in some states?
Yeah, so I think we should be very careful to look at what we're actually seeing. There are some states, they tend to particularly be in the South and the Southwest, many border states, where there have been increases in the number of cases. Even there, it is often very localized. And so far, there are very few places, maybe Arizona might have some cities, but for the most part, our hospital systems are not seriously threatened at this point. Some of these places never really had a first wave, and now they're going through it. And in my state of Pennsylvania, this always was a disease of the elderly and people who were not particularly healthy. 68% of all fatalities in my state of Pennsylvania were inside nursing homes. So our error was not providing sufficient protection to the vulnerable and going too far in quarantining healthy people. Fortunately, that period seems to be mostly behind us in my state and other states throughout the Northeast. In the rest of the country, I think people just need to be careful, go about their business, resume work, but do so keeping a physical distance, wearing a face mask, the personal hygiene that we all know about. Those steps really matter. And as long as they're being followed, I think these states are going to be okay.
But of course, at the same time, it's controversial whether masks are being mandated across parts of the US. You say that hospital systems aren't being threatened, but we know in Houston, ICU beds are at full capacity. Where we see places and states that are having to reassess their reopening and clamp down again, does that change your view that another round of fiscal stimulus may be needed?
I'm still not convinced that that's at all clear. Keep in mind what we've already done. We've already directly appropriated about $3 trillion, and we authorized the Federal Reserve to complement that with lending of about another $3 trillion. So $6 trillion in a matter of a couple of months. That's 30% of America's annual total economic output. It's a staggering number. Most of it actually is not yet even out the door, hasn't gotten to its intended recipients yet. So it's too soon to know whether we really need yet another round. We ought to really understand where the needs might be, if there are still ongoing needs. I do think we need to get on with a safe and careful reopening, and we know how to do that, and the vast majority of the country is doing that successfully. And then finally, I would point out, there's no free lunch here. All of this money is coming from somewhere. Either we're sucking it out of the private sector by borrowing it, or we're going to create it and monetize this debt. And either of those are options that have a cost associated with them.